The night the blind foal walked to the edge of the property and stopped, nobody saw him do it. It was 3 in the morning. The farm was quiet in the way. Farms go quiet in late October. Not peaceful, but holding its breath. The kind of quiet that sits in the chest. Farrell Connick had not slept past 4 in the morning in 11 years. Not since his wife Elaine died in the chair beside the bedroom window. And that night was no different. He lay in the dark, listening to the house creak, and he was thinking, as he often thought in those hours, about the contract on the table downstairs. The one from the land developer out of Knoxville. The one he had not signed yet, the one he kept meaning to sign. He did not hear Cinder leave the barn. He did not hear the soft drum of small hooves crossing the grass, moving east, moving toward the embankment above the Holloway Creek. He did not hear the animal stop at the very edge of the rise, where the property ended and the floodplain began, and stand there without moving, without making a sound. For the better part of an hour, what he heard instead, at 4:17 in the morning, was his daughter's voice from the hallway. She said, "Dad, come outside." That was all she said, but the way she said it made him sit up before he was fully awake. Nadia was 32 years old, and she had been back on the farm for 9 days. And in those 9 days she and Farrell had spoken approximately 400 words to each other, most of them about the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom and whether the contract language gave the developer rights to the creek bed. She had not called him Dad in 7 years. She had not called him anything. Really, she had just not called. So when she said it that way, with that particular quietness, he put his feet on the floor. She was standing in the doorway when he came out. She had her coat over her pajamas and her boots unlaced, and she was looking toward the east field with an expression he recognized. Not fear exactly, but the thing that comes before fear, the moment before the body decides what to do with the information it has just received. "Cinder is at the edge," she said. Farrell looked past her at the field. He could see the foal's pale shape against the dark cinder was almost white in low light, a cream color that the vet had said was unusual for a Morgan cross. He was standing at the top of the embankment, perfectly still, facing the creek. "He does that," Farrell said. "He's been there for over an hour," Nadia said. Farrell looked at her. She'd been watching the foal for over an hour, at 3 in the morning. From what, the window? The porch? He did not ask. "He's blind," Farrell said. "He gets turned around sometimes." But he was not saying that he believed it. He was saying it because it was the kind of thing a man says when he does not want to know what he already suspects. Cinder was 6 months old. He had been born blind, not injured, not infected, but simply born without functional sight. A thing that happens sometimes with inbreeding, the vet had said, though Farrell had been careful with his mares for 20 years, and did not fully accept that explanation. The foal's eyes were intact, pale blue, almost luminescent in daylight, untamed, tracked, even. But they processed nothing. The vet had confirmed it 3 different ways. Cinder moved through the world by sound and smell, and by a quality of attention that Farrell, who was not a sentimental man, could only describe as listening with his whole body. What Farrell had noticed, in the 6 months since Cinder was born, was that the foal had no fear of the dark. Every other animal on the property changed behavior at dusk. The horses grew restless, the dogs came closer to the house. Even the chickens, stupid creatures, knew to return to the coop by instinct. But Cinder moved through darkness and daylight with exactly the same deliberate calm. Because for Cinder, there was no difference. His world had no edges, no shadows, no transition. His world was entirely made of the things that reached him, the pitch and direction of sound, the story the wind told, the information that came up through the ground into his hooves. And that was the thing that Farrell could not quite put out of his mind. Standing at the edge of the porch at 4 in the morning watching the foal stand motionless at the top of the embankment. Because Cinder was facing the creek, and the creek was 60 feet below the embankment, in the dark, behind the tree line, and there was nothing to smell and nothing to hear. No water sound, no animal noise, nothing. And still the foal stood there, facing it, waiting. Farrell went back inside and put on his boots. Nadia was behind him, not saying anything, which was its own kind of language. He went down through the east field with a flashlight, the grass cold and wet under his steps, and when he reached Cinder, the foal did not startle, did not shift, did not even turn his head. He just stood there with his ears forward, his nostrils working in small, slow pulses, his feet set apart and planted like a thing that had decided it was not going to move. Farrell put his hand on Cinder's neck. The skin was warm. He stood beside the foal for a while. Below them, the creek was invisible, silent. The sky to the south was clear. There were stars. He told himself the foal had wandered out and gotten confused in the dark and stopped at the sound of the water, because there was always some water sound if you stood long enough. What he could not explain, would not try to explain until much later. Until after everything happened, was the quality of Cinder's stillness. Because in 6 months, Farrell had seen the foal frightened, had seen him move in the quick, jagged way of a young horse that has registered danger, and this was nothing like that. This was not fear. This was something else. The foal's body had the quality of a compass needle that is found north and does not need to search anymore. He led Cinder back to the barn. The foal came without resistance, without reluctance, but he turned his head back toward the east field once, just before Farrell closed the stall door, turned it, and held it there for a moment, ears forward, listening. Then he was still again. Farrell went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the contract on the table and did not sleep. 3 days later, the Holloway Creek would rise 22 feet in 6 hours. It would destroy the lower pasture fence, take out the equipment shed, and push 4 feet of water through the Jensen property half a mile downstream. It would be the worst flash flood in that county since 1987, and the only part of the Connick farm that the water did not touch, not even the grass, not even the fence posts, was the east field. The high ground above the place where a blind foal had stood alone in the dark and refused to move. But that was still 3 days away, and before any of that happened, Nadia Connick had something she needed to tell her father, something she had driven 600 miles back to this farm to say, and had not yet found a way to begin. She had left in the spring 7 years ago with 2 bags and no explanation that Farrell had found satisfying. She said she needed to go. She said the farm was not a life. She said it in the way young people say things, with absolute certainty and no understanding of what they're asking the other person to do with it. Farrell had watched her drive out and said nothing, because what was there to say? He had spent 31 years building a place where a person could be safe, and she was telling him that was the wrong thing to build. He had not expected her to come back. When she called in early October, not a message, an Actwell call. Her voice strange and careful on the phone. She said she needed to come home for a little while. She said she was fine. She said it twice, which was the first indication that she was not. He had said, "Come whenever you want." He had not asked why. In the 9 days since she'd arrived, she'd fixed the fence on the west side, cleaned the gutters, reorganized the feed shed, and spent an unusual amount of time in the barn with Cinder. Farrell watched all of this from a careful distance, the way he watched most things that he was not sure how to approach. He thought she looked tired. He thought she had learned, somewhere in 7 years, how to carry something without letting it show in her face, but that she had not yet learned how to put it down. He thought all of this. He did not say any of it. What he did not know, in those first 9 days, was why she had really come back. He did not know about the appointment she had canceled in Cincinnati 3 weeks earlier. He did not know about the decision she had been circling for 4 months, the kind of decision that sits at the center of a person's life and changes the weight of everything around it. He did not know that she had driven those 600 miles because she needed to stand in a place where she understood the ground under her feet before she could understand anything else, in a way neither of them would recognize until much later, to a decision she had made 17 years ago, the summer she was 15, in the barn where Cinder now slept. He did not know any of that. What he knew was that his daughter had watched a blind foal stand at the edge of a floodplain in the dark and had come to wake him up and had called him Dad. He just didn't know yet what. The next morning, Cinder was standing at the stall door when Farrell came in at 5:30. Not pacing, not restless, standing at the door with his nose pressed to the gap where the latch sat, his ears moving separately, one tracking the barn entrance and one aimed south, toward the creek. Farrell stopped when he saw it. In 6 months, Cinder had never stood at the door like that. He was a foal who moved in circles, methodical, deliberate loops around the perimeter of his stall, learning the dimensions of his space by repetition. The way blind people learn a room. He had been doing those loops since he was 2 weeks old, and somewhere around month 3, he had stopped bumping into things, had built an interior map so accurate that he could cross the stall at a trot in the dark without touching a wall. But this was not his mapping behavior. This was something different. He had never done that either. Farrell looked south. The sky was the gray of early morning, heavy at the horizon. He checked the weather app on his phone. 30% chance of rain through Thursday. Nothing unusual. No watches, no warnings. He brought Cinder back inside. Nadia was in the kitchen when he came in for coffee. She was standing at the window above the sink, looking out at the sky to the south. And she had the same expression she'd had on the porch at 4 in the morning. That pre-fear quality, that moment of assessment before the body commits. "He says anything new?" she asked, without turning around. Farrell poured his coffee. He said Cinder walked to the barn door and stopped facing south. Nadia turned from the window. He could see something working in her face, that she was deciding whether to say, "He did that with the well," she said. Farrell looked at her. "When I was home that Christmas," she said. "He was a week old. Maybe 2. I took him out of the stall for a few minutes while you were in town, and he walked straight to the old well cover, the one on the west side by the fence, the one that's been boarded over 4 years. He stopped right on top of it, like he knew something was underneath." Farrell remembered that Christmas. He remembered that she had come home for 4 days and they had barely spoken, and she had left on the 12th. He did not remember any of this about Cinder. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I didn't know what it meant then," she said. "I thought it was a coincidence." She turned back to the window. The light had gotten a shade heavier. "What do you think it means now?" Farrell asked. She was quiet for a moment. Tensa sighed. "I think he feels things through the ground." Farrell sat down at the table with his coffee. He was 60 years old, and he was a practical man, and he had spent 4 decades watching animals and knowing the difference between animal intelligence and animal instinct and human projection. He knew what people did when they loved an animal. They saw intention in its behavior. They assigned understanding. They mistook pattern for purpose. He knew all of that. He also knew that Cinder had stood at the top of the embankment above the Holloway Creek for over an hour in the middle of the night, facing south, and that this morning the foal had walked to the barn door and pointed south again, and that there was no scent of water coming from that direction. No sound, no visual cue that could explain it. The thing about growing up on a farm, Farrell had always believed, was that it made a person rational about nature. You saw enough birth and death and disease, and whether to stop romanticizing any of it. You knew that animals operated on systems you didn't have access to, but systems nonetheless: chemistry, physics, the mechanics of a nervous system tuned to frequencies a human body couldn't register. And it was that belief, that rational, material belief, that made what he was sitting with so difficult. Because he could not find the system. He could name what Cinder was doing. He could not explain why. Nadia said. 30% is not a flood, he said. No, she said, without looking at him. I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find a way to start since I got here. Farrell set his cup down. He waited. She turned from the window and sat down across from him at the table and put her hands flat on the wood the way she used to do when she was a child and was about to say something serious. I'm pregnant, she said. The kitchen was very still. Farrell looked at his daughter's face. She was watching him with careful eyes, braced for something, for anger, maybe, or disappointment, or the wrong kind of silence. He said. How long? She said. 20 weeks. He did the calculation without meaning to. 20 weeks was 5 months, which meant she had known since May, which meant she had been carrying this for half a year while whatever had happened, and she had done all of it alone and 600 miles away. He said, The father? She said, It's not a situation, which meant it was a situation, but not a simple one. And he could hear in the way she said it that this particular door was closed, for now, and that pushing it would cost them both something. he said. "Are you all right?" She looked at him for a moment, as if she was trying to figure out what he meant. Tense aside, "I don't know yet. I think I will be." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He was aware of the inadequacy of every possible response, and so he said nothing else. And after a moment, she exhaled a long, slow breath that she had probably been holding since she pulled into the driveway 9 days ago, and he saw her shoulders drop 2 inches. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside the window, the sky was still heavy in the south, gray-bottomed and slow. Then Farrell said, "We should check the creek gauge." Nadia looked at him. He was doing what he had always done with the things that mattered most to him, which was find the thing that needed doing and do it, and let the rest sit in the space around the doing until it found its own shape. She said, "Okay." They drove out to the east fence together in the truck. Farrell had a gauge on the footbridge. A simple staff gauge, a rod marked in feet that he'd installed after the '87 flood as a precaution, and which he had checked, off and on, for 30 years without it ever reading above 4 feet. It read 4.6. He stood on the bridge and looked at the number for a moment. The creek was dark and moving faster than it should be for the amount of rain they'd had. There was foam on the surface, the kind that meant turbulence upstream. The sky to the south was darker now than it had been an hour ago. He said, "Get back in the truck." "What is it?" Nadia said. He said, 4.6. I've never seen it this high without a watch." She looked at the gauge. She looked at the water. She said, "Cinder knew this was coming." Farrell did not say anything. He was already calculating the low pasture, the equipment shed, the vehicles, the bridge itself. For 60 years, and knows exactly which things can be moved and which things cannot. But some part of him, the part that had stood next to the Foal at 4 in the morning with his hand on that warm neck, and felt the quality of that stillness, that part was not calculating. That part was standing somewhere quiet and attending to something that did not have a name yet. He drove them back to the farm. He called the county emergency line from the truck and was put on hold. He called his neighbor, Dale Johnson, and got his voicemail. By 10 o'clock, the sky to the south was the color of a bruise. By noon, it had started to rain. What Farrell did not know, as he began moving equipment to high ground, was that 2 days earlier, before he had seen Cinder at the embankment, before the gauge had gone to 4.6, a weather event had been forming in the mountains 60 miles south. Not a simple rain system, but a compound failure. 2 days of precipitation in the highlands saturating ground that was already at capacity from September's unusual rainfall, and a third-day rain event pushing all of that accumulated water downstream through a network of creeks and tributaries that fed, eventually, into the Holloway. The National Weather Service had issued a flash flood watch that morning, not a warning. The distinction mattered. A watch meant conditions were favorable. A warning meant it was happening. What no instrument measured in those mountains 60 miles south was the moment when the ground hit its limit, when it stopped absorbing and started shedding, when everything that had been held in the high soil began to move. That had happened sometime Tuesday night, while Farrell was lying awake in the dark, while a blind foal was standing at the edge of the embankment, very still, facing south, listening to something moving through the ground toward him. The rain hit hard at 1 in the afternoon. Not a steady rain, but a driving one. The kind that comes in sheets, that makes the fields look like they're steaming. Farrell had moved the trucks to the high ground behind the barn, had brought the horses in from the lower pasture, had stacked as much loose equipment as he could against the back wall of the equipment shed, and left the doors open so the water could move through if it came. Nadia was in the barn. He could see her through the rain moving between the stalls, checking water levels, checking laches, the mechanical motions of a person who had grown up doing exactly this, who had not grown up enough to make her forget how. He went in. She was in Cinder's stall, sitting on the ground beside the Foal, her back against the wall. Cinder was standing. His head was turned slightly, ears forward, a tendon south. He had been like this, on and off, since morning. "He knows," Nadia said. Farrell crouched in the doorway. Outside the rain intensified, a sound like something being poured out of a great height. He said, "How does an animal know something like this?" Nadia looked at him. She said, "Infrasound, They hear it below the range of human hearing. When water moves through rock and soil, it produces low-frequency vibrations. Some animals feel it before any instrument does. Where did you learn that? She looked at the foal. She said, I looked it up at 4 a.m, on my phone, in the kitchen. Farrell was quiet. He looked at Cinder, the pale, steady form of him in the dim light, the way his ears tracked separately, the careful attention in his whole body. But it wasn't just he knew this, without being able to say how he knew it. Infrasound explained the mechanism. It did not explain why Cinder had walked to the highest point of the property and stood there like something that had been sent. The creek gauge, he said. I checked it 20 minutes ago, Nadia said. 7 feet. Farrell stood up. 7 feet. In 2 hours, it had gone from 4.6 to 7. He had lived on this land for 60 years, and he had never seen that rate of rise. He said, We need to move the horses to the upper barn. She was already on her feet. They moved 5 horses in the rain, working without speaking, the way people work together when the work is urgent and they share enough history to have skipped past language. Cinder came last, led by Nadia, his hooves careful and deliberate on the wet ground, his head high, his ears still pointing south. At the entrance to the upper barn, the foal stopped. Not because he was frightened. There was no fear in him, no tension in the muscles under Nadia's hand on his halter, but because he stopped and turned, not south, but north, away from the creek. He held that position for a moment, his nose working, and then he walked into the barn. Nadia looked at Farrell. Isawit, Tohu, something had changed. He didn't know what. But the foal, who had been pointing south for 36 hours, had turned north, and he did not know what that meant. And the rain was not stopping, and the creek was at 7 feet and rising. He went to check the lower pasture. He went alone, which he would later understand was the wrong decision. He went because there were 2 posts on the south fence that he was not certain were set deep enough, and if they went, the fence went, and the lower pasture became part of the creek. What happened in the 40 minutes after that would become in the years that followed, in the conversations he had with his daughter and with Dale Jansen, and eventually with a hydrologist who came out from the university to study the flood pattern, the part of the story that nobody could get exactly right, because no 2 people who talked about it agreed on the timeline. What Farrell remembered was reaching the south fence and finding the posts still solid, which was not the thing he had gone for, but was the first piece of information he received, and then turning to look at the creek and understanding, in a single instant of absolute clarity, that he had made a mistake. The holloway was not at the fence line. It was past the fence line. It was in the lower pasture. Not a trickle, not overflow from a low point, a full surge. Brown water moving fast in a solid wall 2 feet high across the width of the southern end, moving north, moving toward the barn. He had seen high water before. He had never seen it come this way, this fast, with this quality of force. He turned and ran. The water hit him at the back of the pasture, at the rise before the gate. Not the full surge, but the leading edge of it, cold and strong, grabbing at his boots. And he went down on one knee and caught himself on the fence post and held there while the water pushed and kept pushing. And he understood that he had approximately 45 seconds to get through the gate and onto high ground before the decision was made for him. He got through the gate. He lost a boot doing it, his left foot sinking deep into the mud. And he left it and ran the last 100 yards in a sock that was already black with water. And the rain was still coming down in sheets, and visibility was maybe 30 feet, and he could hear the creek now, really hear it. A sound he had not heard in 40 years, a low, concussive roar like something structural giving way. Nadia was at the upper barn when he came over the rise. She saw him, the missing boot, the mud on his jacket, and she was moving toward him before he'd crossed half the distance. He said, "It's in the lower pasture." She said, "I know. I saw the water from the loft. I've been calling you." He found his phone in his pocket. 3 missed calls. The rain had drowned the sound. She took his arm, and they went into the upper barn, and he stood there for a moment, breathing, listening to the roar of the water getting louder. The horses were restless in the stalls, moving and blowing, sensing the sound even through walls. All of them, except Cinder. Cinder was standing the way he had stood at the embankment, still, attended, facing not south this time but the far wall of the barn, north and up, toward the ridge line, the high ground above the property. Farrell looked at the foal. He looked at his daughter. She said, "I think we should go up to the ridge." He said, "The truck's on the high ground, behind the barn." She said, "There's not time to load 5 horses." He looked at her. He said, "We open the stalls." She was already moving. They opened every stall door. Their horses went, not panicked, but fast, moving in the intelligent way of animals whose instincts are older than their domesticity, out through the upper barn door and up the slope toward the tree line. Cinder went last, or rather Cinder did not go anywhere. He stood in the open doorway of his stall for a moment, and then turned and walked out on his own. No lead, no direction, and crossed the barn and went out the upper door and up the slope without hesitation. Without sight, without ever having been on that hillside, he walked straight up to the tree line, where the other horses had gathered, and stopped. Farrell watched him do it. He watched a blind horse navigate a hillside he had never walked in perfect darkness and rain and find the highest ground on the property. By some means that the rational part of Farrell's mind could not account for, and the other part, the part that had pressed his hand against that warm neck at 4 in the morning and felt the quality of that stillness, did not need to. Then Nadia was beside him, and they were climbing. The flood reached the upper barn at 3:47 in the afternoon. Farrell knew the time because he checked his phone when they heard the change in the water sound, a new note in the roar, a crashing, structural sound, and he looked at the screen and marked it, the way men of his generation marked the time when things happened that they knew they would spend the rest of their lives remembering. From the ridge they could see the lower pasture. It was gone. In its place was a brown moving mass of water, and through it the tops of the fence posts moved, and then they stopped moving because the fence was gone. The equipment shed roof was visible, and then it was not. The lower half of the upper barn was dark with water, and the horses were in the trees, and Cinder was standing at the edge of the tree line facing east, where the sky was beginning, just barely, to lighten. Nadia sat on a wet rock with her arms around her knees and her chin up, watching the water. Farrell stood beside her. The rain was still coming, lighter now. The main force of it passed. He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "About the baby?" He said, "About the reason you came back." She looked at the water for a moment. She said, "There was someone. It didn't work. He wanted me to make a decision I wasn't ready to make, and I made the wrong one, and by the time I understood what I'd done, it was too late to make it right." Farrell waited. She said, "I came back because I needed to be somewhere I knew. Somewhere the ground was real." She paused. "I came back because I needed to tell you, and I didn't know how to start." He sat down beside her. His daughter, and he did not say anything for a little while. Then he said, "You were 15. That summer, when you spent so much time in the barn." She went very still. She said, "Yes," he said. "I knew something happened. I didn't know what. I kept thinking you'd tell me when you were ready." She turned to look at him. Her face was wet from the rain and also from something else, and she made no effort to conceal either. She said, 17 years is a long time to be ready." He said, "I know." She said, "I didn't know how to say it without it changing everything." He said, "It was always going to change everything. That's not the same as it being too late." The creek roared below them. One of the horses moved in the trees. The sky in the east had a line of pale gray along the horizon. Not light exactly, but the absence of dark, the first concession the sky makes before light returns. Cinder stood at the tree line. He was not facing south anymore. He was facing east, toward the light. That wasn't light yet. The water receded over 2 days. The lower pasture was a ruin. Fence gone, soil stripped, deposits of stone and debris that would take months to clear. The equipment shed was gone, its contents scattered across a 1/4 mile of floodplain. The bridge at the east fence was gone. But the upper barn stood. The house stood. The high ground held. The horses came down from the ridge on the second morning. Not called, but on their own time, walking in a group across the wet grass, Cinder in the middle of them, moving with that deliberate accuracy that never failed to stop Farrell's breath for a moment. Dale Jansen lost 6 head of cattle, and his hay storage, and a truck he hadn't quite gotten high enough in time. He came over on the third day and walked the Connick property with Farrell and said, "You got lucky." Farrell said, "Yeah." Dale looked at the high water line on the upper barn and said, "Whatever made you get the horses up the ridge when you did, that was the right call." Farrell looked at the barn. He said, "Wasn't me." Dale waited. Farrell said, "The Foal." Dale Jansen had known Farrell Connick for 30 years. He knew when Farrell was joking, and he knew when he wasn't. And this was not one of the times he was joking. Dale looked out at the field where Cinder was grazing, moving around the low end of the pasture with that careful, methodical pattern. Head down, hooves, finding the ground precisely. He said, "The blind one." Farrell said, "Yeah." Dale was quiet for a moment. He said, "How?" Farrell said, "I don't know. Not completely. Nadia thinks it's infrasound low-frequency vibrations through the ground from the water moving through the hills. She says some animals feel it earlier than any instrument picks it up," Dale said. "Bah," Farrell said, "but that doesn't explain why he walked to the highest point of the property and stood there. It might explain that he felt something. It doesn't explain that he knew what to do about it." Dale had no answer for that. Neither did Farrell. What Farrell did have, what he had been sitting with since the night he stood beside Cinder at the embankment, was a feeling he could not precisely name, not wonder exactly. Something quieter than wonder. The feeling of having been in the presence of something that operated by rules you did not fully understand, and of having been, by that presence, kept safe. Nadia stayed through the winter. She had not planned to. She had planned to tell Farrell what she needed to tell him and go back to Cincinnati and figure out the rest alone, the way she had been figuring out things alone for 7 years. But the flood happened, and then the cleanup, and then the winter came early, and the roads were bad, and she stayed. She stayed, and she and Farrell talked. Not easily, not without long silences, not without days when neither of them could find the language for what needed to be said. But they talked. In the evenings, after the work was done, sitting at the kitchen table the way they used to sit before, Elaine died, and everything in the house became a reminder of what wasn't there anymore. They talked. She told him about the summer when she was 15, about the thing that had happened that she had carried for 17 years without putting it down. He listened without interrupting, which was the hardest thing he had ever done, and when she finished, he did not try to fix it or reframe it or find the lesson in it. He just said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I should have seen it," she said. "You didn't know," he said. "I should have seen." It was not a satisfying exchange. Satisfying was not what it was for. It was the beginning of the thing, the slow and difficult and necessary beginning, and both of them knew it. The baby was a boy. Nadia decided to name him Arden. She said the name had come to her one morning in the barn, sitting with Cinder while the foal did his methodical loops around the perimeter of his stall, and that once it came she couldn't put it down. Farrell said it was a good name. He meant it. In March, Nadia drove back to Cincinnati to begin the process of moving her life. She was coming back. This was established, not discussed. Simply a thing that was now true, but there were arrangements to make, a job to leave, an apartment lease to end. She would be back before the baby came. Farrell watched her drive out for the second time in 7 years. This time, it was different. He did not know exactly how to describe the difference, only that the first time there had been a space left in the farm's atmosphere, a pressure drop, like something essential removed, and this time the air was just air. She would be back. He went into the barn. Cinder was at his stall door again, not pointing anywhere this time, not braced against anything, just at the door, head up, attending in the general direction of Farrell's footsteps, the way he always did when he heard the barn door open. Farrell went into the stall and put his hand on the foal's neck. 7 months old now, starting to look less like a foal and more like the horse. He would become long legs, a clean, strong jaw, that pale cream coat that the vet said would darken slightly with age. His eyes were pale blue, almost luminescent. They tracked across Farrell's face without seeing it. Farrell stood there with his hand on the foal's neck and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because Cinder did not need words to understand that this was a moment, that something had been resolved and something was beginning, and that the man standing beside him was, for the first time in a very long time, not braced against something that was coming, but simply standing. He stood there for a while. Then he went inside and found the contract on the kitchen table, the one from the Knoxville developer, the one he had not signed and had been meaning to sign, the one that would have sold the Connick property for 11 acres at fair market value and ended 120 years of family ownership. He folded it in half. He put it in the drawer with the utility bills and the spare keys and the photograph of Elaine from the summer before she got sick. He closed the drawer, more as an acknowledgement of something that had already been decided by the winter, by the conversations at the kitchen table, by a boy not yet born who would need to learn what ground felt like under his feet, by a blind foal who had known, before any instrument, before any forecast, before any human mind had assembled the information into something that could be understood, that the water was coming, and who had walked, in the dark, to the highest place he could find, and stood there, and waited for the people he loved to follow. The hydrologist from the university came in April to study the flood pattern on the Holloway Creek. She was a woman named Vesper Crane, who had been mapping flash flood behavior in the region for 12 years, and she was thorough and precise and not given to sentimentality. And she spent 2 days on the Connick property mapping water levels and erosion patterns and soil displacement. On the second afternoon, she asked Farrell to walk her to the east embankment, the high ground above the floodplain where Cinder had stood at 4 in the morning 3 days before the flood. She stood there and looked at the floodline below and made notes in her notebook. Then she crouched down and looked at the ground and made a few more notes. Farrell asked what she was looking at. She said, "There's an interesting erosion boundary here. The water came up to this exact line and stopped. Below it, the soil is completely displaced. Above it," she gestured at the dry ground beneath their feet, "nothing. Not even the grass bent," he said. The high ground held. She looked at the line where the flood had stopped. She said, "Yes, but it's unusual. The geometry of this flood should have covered this embankment. The water had enough force, but it stopped exactly here, as if something had redirected it, some underground rock formation, maybe, or a subsurface drainage feature we haven't found yet." She went back to her notes. Farrell looked at the ground, the way you could see the tree line and the creek mouth at the same time from just there. He thought about low-frequency vibrations moving through stone and soil and roots. He thought about a nervous system tuned to frequencies a human body couldn't register. He thought about all the rational, material, explicable mechanisms that might account for what a blind foal had done. And then he thought about Cinder standing at the door of the upper barn in the rain, facing north, and then turning, when they had moved the horses, and walking without being led, without ever having walked to that hillside, straight up to the highest ground on the property. As if he hadn't just felt something, as if he had known where to go. In the section describing the east embankment she had written, the precise stopping point of the flood at this location remains unexplained by the terrain data and may warrant further subsurface investigation. The envelope came with a note that said, "Mr. Connick, an unusual property. I've been studying flood behavior for 12 years, and I find that the most interesting question is never where the water went. It's what stopped it." Farrell read the note twice. He put it in the drawer with the folded contract and the photograph of Elaine and the spare keys. In the barn, Cinder moved through the dark in his slow, deliberate loops, learning the dimensions of the world through the information that reached him, building his map of it one careful step at a time. What no one who visited the farm in the months after the flood ever fully understood. Not Vesper Crane, not the county extension agent who came to assess the pasture damage, was that the highest ground on the Connick property, the exact patch of earth where the water had stopped, and the grass had not bent, and the foal had stood for an hour in the dark, was also the spot where Elaine Connick had scattered the ashes of her own mother 31 years before, on a morning in March, when the creek was low and the ground was cold, and she had said, "This is the place. This is the highest place." Farrell had not thought of that in years. He thought of it now. He did not know what to do with it, not in any rationale, material, explicable sense. E just held Italiano. He just stood there in the barn in the light afternoon light, watching a blind horse move through the dark like something guided by a compass no one else could read, and held it.